Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I am discussing J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, which I have here in my copy of the Tolkien Reader, but was originally composed as a lecture, an Andrew Lang lecture in 1938. But later it was also expanded upon a bit and presented in a collection of essays called Essays Presented to Charles Williams by Oxford University Press in 1947. And it is that version which appears here in the Tolkien Reader. This is an essay that I wanted to talk about on the channel because it was very influential for me as a young person becoming more and more invested in fantasy as a genre, and it had a big impact on me. And I think it's fair to say that it's had a large influence over many people who are interested in fantasy, who grew up loving fantasy, and many writers of fantasy as well. So I wanted to just touch on it. Mostly what I'm going to be doing here is summarizing some of the salient points from Tolkien's essay in hopes that people will go and read the original essay, which I'm sure is available online, and perhaps think about it themselves, because I think he makes some very wonderful points that many people have expanded on and have become, I think, part of what many of us believe about our genre, about fantasy, and what fantasy can do and where it comes from. And just a note, the word fantasy was not the name for the genre at the time that he originally wrote this lecture in 1938. The word fantasy was coined a little bit later as a description for the genre. But he does mention the word fantasy and has his own special definition of it within the essay, which I will touch upon. So when he says fairy stories, he means a lot of different things. Of course, he means the more traditional fairy stories that go way back, that are very much related to myth in many respects. But I think he also means modern creators of what we would call fantasy as well, which share fantasy of the modern era. The creations of individual writers share many important things in common with these older forms of storytelling. So, and with those little provisos, let's talk about the essay. And one of the first things that Tolkien establishes is that fairy stories should not be relegated to children. The realm of fairy is something that is very much for adults and as well as children. It really has little to do with the age of the person and more to do with the person's taste, whether or not a person would enjoy fairy stories. And it is also most certainly not, fairy stories are not supernatural. In fact, Tolkien asserts that they are more natural than anything. And there's a wonderful quote in here that I'm going to read from the essay. Quite a few quotes in here I'm going to be reading, but the first one has to do with this idea of fairy stories and the realm of fairy itself being much more natural than even, well, a lot of people tend to be. So, what Tolkien says specifically is, fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. So, it's a wonderful notion, I think. The idea that when you're tapping into fairy stories, you're not tapping into something that is unnatural or supernatural. It is simply the natural. It is, of course, also magic at the same time, and a specific sort of magic, a sort of enchantment that transports the reader into a secondary world. And Tolkien has some wonderful notions along these lines in his essay, beginning with this quote here. The magic of fairy is not an end in itself. Its virtue is in its operations. Among these are the satisfaction of a certain primordial human desires. One of these desires is to survey the depths of space and time. Another is to hold communion with other living things. To hold communion with other living things. I think that's a beautiful thing. And he elaborates a little bit later in the essay as well, saying, The primal desire at the heart of fairy is the realization, independent of the conceiving mind, of imagined wonder. And this state of wonder is a very important element of these secondary worlds that we are transported into when we participate in a fantasy or fairy stories. In discussing the origins of fairy stories, Tolkien brings up this term, the Cauldron of Story, which he somewhat more facetiously refers to as the pot of soup, which he capitalizes. And either way, it refers to a somewhat mysterious collective source of inspiration. And this source of inspiration is something in which various figures and stories are placed, and they are thus transformed. And he gives the example of King Arthur being a fantastic personage who has undergone the transformation as a result of being steeped in this pot of soup, or Cauldron of Story. And it specifically says, there he, meaning King Arthur, he was boiled for a long time together with many other older figures and devices of mythology and fairy, and even some other stray bones of history, such as Alfred's defense against the Danes, until he emerged as a king of fairy. So that in regard to King Arthur. And as such, these stories that are steeped in fairy transcend history. And another thing he says in that regard here is that fairy stories open a door on other time. And he capitalizes other and time here. Fairy stories open a door on other time, and if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time itself, maybe. So that is a very beautiful notion, and you can see there is something transcendent to fairy stories. And when they work, they also go beyond what is called the willing suspension of disbelief. This Tolkien asserts. It goes beyond the willing suspension of disbelief into a sort of belief. And this is where he touches on the notions, and these are very famous Tolkienian words, of the secondary world and the sub-creator. And I'm going to read another passage here to do with these very important terms. This is central to how Tolkien saw himself as a writer, as a creator of fantasy, essentially. So let me read what Tolkien has to say on the notions of, a little bit of it anyway, the notions of secondary worlds and sub-creators. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. And so this belief is related to the notion of desirability, resonating with a sense of yearning within the human mind that the sub-creation successfully awakens. And he has another wonderful quote in respect to this. And just let me find it here. And it is related to the notion, a specific example, one of my favorites that he gives, that was something that has stuck with me over the years, is dragons. Why do we love dragons? Why are they interesting? And this is an example of this, this secondary world awakening this kind of yearning within us, that a successful subcreation does. And dragons, he says, the dragon had the trademark of fairy written plain upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was an other world. Fantasy, the making or glimpsing of other worlds, was the heart of the desire of fairy. I desired dragons with a profound desire. And I think that many of us who love fantasy can relate to this notion. And also the fact that fairy stories offer what all literature offers, a reflection on the human experience that we find helpful in making sense of life. And Tolkien very clearly understands this function of fairy stories as a function that is common to all of literature. But he also asserts that fairy stories are especially apt for giving, and these are very important concepts that he defines, fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And these are concepts so important that he capitalizes them in the essay. And so let's begin with fantasy and how he defines it. And beginning with the fact that fantasy is related to imagination. And through imagination and art comes subcreation. So one must have imagination and one must use art in order to be a sub-creator. Fantasy, however, and this is where it gets really interesting to me, fantasy embraces both the, and this is where the quote starts, both the sub-creative art in itself and a quality of strangeness and wonder in the expression derived from the image, a quality essential to fairy story. So the quality of strangeness and wonder is something that is intrinsic to fairy story. And that is what he's calling fantasy here, as well as the expression achieved through art and imagination. So he uses that word to define all these things. And with this advantage of what he calls arresting strangeness, this is a great Tolkienian term that my friend A.P. Canavan has talked about on his channel, A Critical Dragon. I'll put a link in the description below to the video where he talks about arresting strangeness. But with the advantage of arresting strangeness, and what Tolkien means essentially by arresting strangeness is that quality of wonder that fantasy produces within us, that is free from mundane reality. So with this advantage of arresting strangeness, fantasy is, and I'm going to quote again here, not a lower but a higher form of art. Indeed, the most nearly pure form, and so, when achieved, the most potent. It is pure because it stems from the human imagination. And so, it is also something that is not easy to achieve, being this high form of art. Tolkien is very clear about that. It is, he says, in another quote here, to make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks. But when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art. Indeed, narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode. So he says, so fantasy in this potent mode is a vehicle, says Tolkien, for great truths. According with reason. These great truths accord with reason and with the recognition of fact, but not a slavery to fact. And so this is one of the most important central notions to what he sees as fairy stories / fantasy. Another very important notion that he talks about is recovery, which is a cathartic regaining, that word is key here, regaining of a clear view, an overcoming of the triteness that comes with familiarity, which is very much in our times a product of the age we live in, I think. So Tolkien is we'll get into this a little bit more, but he is most certainly not a fan of many aspects of the modern world. But he has some very interesting things to say about recovery here. And so I'm going to read another quote. We should look at the green again and be startled anew, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. And he continues with this notion just a little bit later with this passage. By the forging of Gram, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stalk, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. And further he writes, it was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. So what Tolkien is talking about here, this recovery, this notion of recovery, is seeing the world anew. That being immersed in the fairy story, in fantasy, allows us to see again and appreciate the world we live in, to see the magic of the world we live in, to overcome the triteness of everyday, mundane reality. And a related concept is escape. Escape is not only practical, says Tolkien, but it is also heroic. And I want to read what he says in this regard here. Why should a man, this is a quote, why should a man be scorned if finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. And so this is very much in part Tolkien's reaction against modern society, against the ugliness, the sordidness of modern society and industrialization. And it's very clear in Lord of the Rings and elsewhere that he was not a big fan of machinery and the ruination of the countryside. He certainly has a preference in this regard for lightning over the drabness of streetlights. So, and in fact, he poses the question, I think very effectively, is such wonder, in fact, less real? I'm putting air quotes around that. Is it less real? What fairy stories offer then is the capacity to return to something that modern life has made seem less real, but is perhaps fundamental to our well-being. And there's also more to escape, says Tolkien. I'm going to read another passage in regard to this. There's more to escape than just getting away from the ugliness of modern life. There's much more to. In fact, these stories have been around for a lot longer than industrialization, and they offered a type of escape that he defines here. But there are also other and more profound escapisms that have always appeared in fairy tale and legend. There are other things more grim and terrible to fly from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, and death. And even when men are not facing hard things such as these, there are ancient limitations from which fairy stories offer a sort of escape, and old ambitions and desires touching the very roots of fantasy, to which they offer a kind of satisfaction and consolation. And the word consolation comes up there, and it is perhaps even more important for Tolkien than escape. It is especially in terms of what he calls the happy ending. And this is where Tolkien coins the word Eucatastrophe, which he asserts is the highest function of fairy stories. It is in the midst of tragedy and defeat, Eucatastrophe is the sudden joyous turn. And I'm going to let Tolkien define it here for us because he puts it in words that I couldn't possibly come close to. So this sudden joyous turn, he says, this joy, I'm quoting now, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist, nor fugitive. And he puts escapist and fugitive in quotes here, alluding to not the way in which he defined escape, but the way in which critics of fantasy or fairy stories sort of turn their noses down on fantasy. So, once again, this joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat. And insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy. Joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And you can hear certainly almost a numinous tone to what Tolkien is talking about here. And it is absolutely true that he relates this to his own faith. He was very much a devout Roman Catholic. And so for Tolkien, this Eucatastrophe in fairy stories, in fantasy, is a glimpse of the larger truth of salvation, the salvation that he believed in through his faith. So that is very much a part of the end of his exploration of fairy stories. And I think, though, that one doesn't necessarily even need to share that particular faith to recognize the sudden joyous turn that Tolkien is talking about within stories. And these are moments that I think we can all relate to. Certainly for me, reading the end of Lord of the Rings. And the particular moments when the world has been saved and they're celebrating the hobbits, and even the poignancy of Frodo finally leaving Middle-earth. These are moments that are absolutely painful in their beauty and their joy. And so I certainly do relate to what Tolkien is talking about here, with this notion of the sudden joyous turn and Eucatastrophe as being something of a consolation, of being something that helps us to process the pain and the suffering and all the things that we go through in our actual existence here. So this is just a really quick taste of what is actually about a 60-page essay here. So you can see that I'm really just highlighting some very important major points as I see them in Tolkien's essay. So once again, I do encourage you to check out the essay for yourselves. It is an essay that has been massively influential in the understanding of fantasy. And I hope you've enjoyed this little glimpse of it. It might be something that I'll return to eventually. I think I'll be reading and perhaps doing a video on The Leaf by Niggle as well in the near future. This is in Tolkien's mind, it was a companion piece to the essay on fairy stories. So it is a further commentary of this sort as well. But I hope you've enjoyed this for now, and until next time.